My name is Pamela, and welcome to this pre-concert talk. The first piece that I'll be introducing today will be Debussy's Petite. The pianists of you out there might have played it at some point in your lives because it was first written as a piano duet, four hands, and much later orchestrated by Henri Duzet for orchestra. Debussy conceived of the idea of writing the suite during his 2-year residency in Rome, where he had actually won the Grand Prix de Rome for a cantata that he wrote. He took residency there in the 1880s, and there he was extremely inspired by composers such as Palestrina and Lassus, not so much Verdi and Donizetti. This kind of inspiration and affinity that he had for the previous composers from the former generations could have been the impetus for him to consciously adopt the idea, the musical framework of a suite, which is a very prominent genre during the Baroque times. And in the third movement, he deliberately cast a minuet. So in 1889, Debussy and his publisher friend, Jacques Durand, actually performed this four-hands duet in a salon. Now, we may be wondering, well, what kind of pianist was Debussy? What kind of pianistic persona did he have? Was he a superstar virtuoso? Was he more frail? And again, I'll share with you all a quote that describes Debussy's piano playing. He cradled the piano, talked softly to it, like a rider to his horse, a shepherd to his flock, or a thresher to his oxen. In any discussions of the Petite Suite, we also ought to recall the figure of Paul Verlaine, the poet. We could conclude that Paul Verlaine was one of Debussy's favorite poets because a third of his songs were actually set to texts written by Verlaine. In the Petite Suite, there are actually two movements, the first two movements, set to Verlaine's poems. The first one is entitled En bateau, which describes sailboats. And again, I'll be reading out the first and last stanzas of the poem for you. It's an erotic poem set at sea, and very romantic, very wistful, very dreamy, but ultimately ends on a note of non-consummation. The shepherd's star, it shivers, the steersman in darker waters, seeks fire in the depth of his trousers. Now's the hour, gentlemen, or never to be daring, and you'll discover my hands from now on all over. Meanwhile, the moon sheds its glow on the sailboat's brief course below, gaily riding the dream flow. Moving on from this first composition by Debussy, the Petite Suite, which has been transcribed not only for orchestra, but so many other instruments, such as even an arrangement for 7 saxophones. I'll now like to talk about Ravel's Piano Concerto. So Ravel was a contemporary of Debussy, and for the longest time in his life, he had a real deep wish to write a piano concerto for himself to perform as soloist. And he did always have this fantasy, but due to his ill health and debilitated physical state, he had to give up this wish of he being the soloist in the concerto, and it was finally premiered in 1932 by the pianist Marguerite Long. And they toured Europe, a total of about 16 different cities with it. It's really remarkable to think of how she pulled this feat off in such a short time. She had only received the manuscript 2 months before its actual performance. A couple of musicologists have actually identified the jazz elements which pervade the piece, and this could be attributed to Ravel's 1928 visit to North America, where in New York and New Orleans, he was exposed to jazz elements, which could have been a direct inspiration for him to write parts of this concerto. However, apart from looking at the year 1928, we should also look backwards, because even as early as 1911, we are told that Ravel was already sketching material for a Basque concerto for piano and orchestra. Ravel himself said that he was very much inspired by Mozart and Saint-Saëns in the writing of this. And here I'm going to read out another quotation. Ravel says, "The music of a concerto should, in my opinion, be light-hearted and brilliant, and not aim at profundity or at dramatic effects. It has been said of certain classics that their concertos were written not for but against the piano. I heartily agree. I had intended to title this concerto Divertissement. Then it occurred to me that there was no need to do so because the title concerto should be sufficiently clear." Lacking in depth and profundity, I think it is really up to the individual listener to draw his or her own conclusions, especially when we listen to the Adagio Assai, the slow movement of this gorgeous, beautiful, poetic concerto with its unending melody that takes a cue from the larghetto of Mozart's clarinet quintet. So moving on from Debussy and Ravel, the idea of the petite, the compact, the reduced, the diminutive, looking backwards, I'd like to talk about Beethoven's 8th Symphony now. Sandwiched between the 7th and the 9th, it is somewhat a rather more a scaled down symphony, if I may say. It did not receive the same kind of fanfare. Beethoven was quite infuriated over the lack of uproar and enthusiasm that happened at its premiere. Its reception was very lukewarm in 1814. Beethoven himself nicknamed the 8th Symphony the Petite F major symphony. As some of you may know, the other F major symphony is number 6, the Pastoral, which takes place over 6 movements compared to 4 movements in the 8th. There is no slow movement in the 8th Symphony. It's the only symphony that has no dedication as well. And in place of the slow movement, the 2nd movement is an allegro scherzando, and the 3rd movement is a tempo di minuetto. It wasn't an actual minuet, but we can think of how Beethoven himself was playing and toying with the idea of the minuet. He wanted to evoke the leisurely pace, the tempo of a minuet. And once again, we know that the minuet was a rather antiquated form. Beethoven had preferred the scherzo instead over the minuet. But then again, in the 8th Symphony, he chooses to resuscitate the genre of the minuet. In this concert, we have 3 composers featured: Debussy, Ravel, and Beethoven. French Impressionism and 17th and 18th century, what is the connection between these composers? I would say that the idea of the petite, the diminutive, is very prominent here. And the idea of how these 3 composers have actually taken old forms, old ideas or traditions, and have reworked these old forms, traditional classical forms, into their own musical language.